Right now, we are at a turning point. AI isn't just beating humans at games, we're also using AI to start to decode life. Up until now, it's taken on average 15 years and around $2.6 billion to bring one drug to market, and then 90% of them still fail. Discovering new drugs, new medicines, has basically throughout the history of humanity been about trial and error. Billion-dollar bets, basically blindfolded. And so today, with these hugely powerful models, what if AI can predict and then eventually develop the drugs that really work? In today's episode, we're going to discuss exactly that with a really special guest, Laksh Aithani, founder of Charm Therapeutics. Charm has been backed by some phenomenal investors like Nvidia, Khosla Ventures, and General Catalyst, and they're rewriting how we understand and treat disease.
AI should be, in the future, applied to each and everything that the human society does. AI is going to have a really big impact in drug discovery.
So without further ado, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe. Now let's get into it. Laksh, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Thank you, Joe, for having me. Appreciate it.
So before we jump into Charm, I guess for those that haven't met you, what do I need to know to understand the context of Laksh and the person sitting in front of me today?
Yeah, well, and I think obviously Charm plays a large part because that's a pretty big part of my life, at least at the moment. So, you know, I founded this company, Charm, just over 3 years ago. Before that, and Charm is, you know, a company that's working on using AI to discover new drugs for various diseases, including cancer. Before that, I was at a company called Exscientia, which actually does, you know, something similar. So they also use AI, a different approach, but also use AI to discover drugs. They actually very recently merged with even yet another company that does a similar thing called Recursion. They're both listed on the NASDAQ. So that was what I did before this, and that's where I really, you know, started to enjoy this process of drug discovery, but also applying technology and AI to drug discovery, which really gave me the inspiration to start Charm. And yeah, so before that, I founded another company which is called Genie, which I guess that's how I know you, Joe, that you live with.
Yeah, we met through Jack and Adrian.
Yeah, one of the Genie co-founders, and that company, I guess now it's changed its name, but when it was Genie, it was using AI to analyze documents and analyze, you know, medical research reports, for example. Mm-hmm. You know, the problem with that was it was quite far ahead in its time. So, you know, this was like six years ago, and obviously AI was, I guess, a lot earlier back then, 5-6 years ago. So, you know, it was quite hard to build really compelling software with AI back then. But of course now it's much easier.
And before Genie, I think you studied at Cambridge. Was that natural sciences? How did you find yourself winding up in drug discovery and in AI?
So I mean, I've always been fascinated by chemistry, and that's what I studied actually. I did study in Cambridge, and that was really also the place where I started to learn to code as well. And you know, that's really the place where I kind of really got interested in, you know, chemistry and biology and drug discovery.
And I think only recently in 2024, your co-founder David Baker got awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry based on the work that, you know, perhaps you'd been doing in Charm.
Let's not downplay David's work. This is just for David's work, right? So obviously Charm's work, and it has a lot of historical precedent as well. And of course, you know, what Charm's working on is definitely related to David's work.
What did you both see when you were in Exscientia? You were a research scientist there. Yeah. You were working directly with the end use case of AI in drug discovery. So what inspired you to start Charm?
The thing that really inspired me was, so before about, let's say, late 2020, it was very hard to apply AI to 3D structures. So the world of biology is, you know, there are these really small, essentially biological machines called proteins, and they have these very complex 3D shapes that are very bespoke, and the shape depends on the sequence of the protein. So predicting the shape has historically been very difficult, and doing any sorts of modeling with this 3D shape has been difficult. And essentially, in late 2020, DeepMind, they discovered essentially a way to predict the shape of a protein with AI, and they named that AlphaFold. And then, very quickly, David Baker also came up with a similar discovery called RosettaFold. And that was people were doing this type of task before, like predicting protein shapes, but the level of accuracy never quite got to what they got to in late 2020. Like that was a big step change, and that really made a lot of people's heads turn, and a lot of experts in the field were, wow, this is incredible, the level of accuracy you can now achieve. This is basically like, we're starting to now get to experimental levels of accuracy with a computational approach, an AI approach. And that's really what made me pay a lot of attention to that, and also start to maybe think about how that sort of technology could be applied to drug discovery.
But I'd love to maybe step back before we get into Charm and what you're working on with DragonFold, for example. Let's first understand the world of biotech.
Yeah.
So I guess in your world, what, in your own words, how would you kind of help somebody that has no experience in the space to understand where is the value created, where is it driven?
Sure, yeah. So I guess, essentially biotech is all about treating diseases. So how are diseases treated? Well, first you need to identify the cause of the disease. And almost always, not always, but almost always, the root cause of a disease is a protein in the body or in the particular organ or cell type where the disease is happening. And this protein is malfunctioning in some way. It's not working properly, and therefore it causes the cell type or organ to malfunction. For example, if you've got lung cancer, then oftentimes you'll have a protein in your lungs where the cancer is, and this protein is called EGFR, and it is malfunctioning, and it's basically telling the cells to grow too much, and therefore turn into a cancerous growth. So if you're able to then actually design a drug to go into the cell and then essentially bind to the malfunctioning protein, disease-causing protein, then you might be able to treat the disease. And this is exactly what's happened actually with this particular disease, lung cancer. It's well treated with these drugs known as EGFR inhibitors that bind to the EGFR protein. So then the challenge becomes, okay, well, how do you design a drug that binds to a particular protein? And that is a really tough challenge. And historically, that's been through actually just experimental screening of millions of potential drugs to see which one actually physically sticks to the protein. And the reason why people do this is because it's very hard to model on a computer how the drug and the protein bind together. And that's because it's a complex 3D modeling problem. So then now we've broken down the problem to, well, can you now actually take an AI and predict how protein and small molecule bind? And that's really what we focus on at Charm. So I'll get to that later, but let's assume you can now do that. You can get a drug that binds to the protein well. That's step one. And you know that this protein causes the disease. So step two is then making sure that that drug is actually going to probably be safe and work in humans, right? And what does that involve? Well, that involves, for example, making sure that it isn't broken down by the body too quickly. Because if it's broken down in, let's say it's broken down in an hour or 30 minutes, then it means you're going to have to take a pill every 30 minutes, which is really not convenient for patients. So really you want to make sure that the pill is taken maybe once or twice a day for the patients, and that means that the drug needs to stay in the body for a long enough time.
Before it's metabolized?
Exactly. So you want the drug to be metabolically stable. Then you also want it to be safe, right? You only want it to hit the protein that's causing the disease. You don't want it to hit other proteins that are functioning completely fine and then cause those proteins to malfunction, because that can cause side effects. So once you've done all of those things, you've made sure that the drug is metabolically stable, it binds to the protein that causes the disease, it doesn't bind to any other proteins, then you need to, test it in, toxicology studies. And once you've done that, you can then start testing it in humans. Now, the human testing process is a very complex process in itself, but I'll maybe summarize it into the early clinical trials and the late stage clinical trials. So the early stage clinical trials is where you're really trying to show that the drug is safe in humans, and it's also, it lasts long enough in the body in humans, so it achieves sufficient exposure.
This would be phase 1.
Yeah, that's phase 1. And then, you can sometimes see signs of efficacy, so signs of the drug working in phase 1. So for example, you might see that a lung cancer patient, their tumor size will shrink, so the cancer will shrink. So you might see that in phase 1. Then you go into phase 2, where you're now starting to more thoroughly evaluate how well the drug works. So you've proven it's safe, you've proven it lasts long enough in the body. Now, how well does it work to treat the disease? And so for cancer, you want to show reductions in the cancer size, but you also want to show increased durability, so ability for these patients to continue to take the drug for a long time and still be fine, right? Because oftentimes they might take a drug and be fine for a while, but the cancer will return. And then finally, the thing that people ultimately care about in cancer is survival, overall survival, right? So you want to ultimately show that when you give your drug, the patients on average live longer compared to whatever the current standard of care is. Now that process is unfortunately, it's quite a long process and can take several years, let's say 3 to 10 years, and it can often cost several hundred millions of dollars, depending on how large the clinical trials are. So that's the clinical development process, and then the drug can get approved. So you apply for approval to the regulatory agencies such as the FDA, and then you can start selling the drug.
Super, super quick one from me. As you know, Founders and Builders podcast is a completely new channel. So if you're enjoying this episode, feel free to hit the subscribe button down below. And now let's get back into it. So what I'm understanding is like phase 1 is around safety predominantly. Phase 2, it sounds like is the efficacy of the drug. And then phase 3, what, like that we're confident that it works at scale?
Confirmation of the efficacy in a large patient population.
Got it.
Just to be really sure that the drug works. Because, once this drug is approved, it's going to be quite hard to, take it off the market if there are any problems in the future.
Is that common?
Yeah, drugs are sometimes taken off the market. For example, if there's a really bad side effect that's discovered, after the clinical trials are done, and then that can necessitate a drug being taken off market. So, but yeah, the phase 3 trials are to really make sure that the drug, is really going to have a benefit such that for the next 20 to 50 years, where this drug is used as a standard of care, people know that it's better than what was there before.
So those are the 3 phases of the clinical trial. The big pharma companies are obviously looking at, drugs that could potentially be the next blockbuster. But help us understand how that clinical trial data could be beneficial for them.
Phase 2 efficacy data is normally representative of what you're going to see in phase 3. So maybe to sort of give it to you in probabilistic terms, for something that's in phase 1, it, let's say, has a 30% chance of working in phase 2. It has a 30% chance of showing really good efficacy in real humans in phase 2. But once you've shown that, then you've probably got a 70% chance or even 80 or 90% chance of working in phase 3. So that's why the big pharma companies will often want to buy the so-called de-risked assets, which are assets that have phase 2 data but haven't necessarily started phase 3 trials. So the reason why pharma companies do this is because they have their own commercial portfolio of various drugs, and each of these drugs will have a patent life. What that means is, each of these drugs has a patent, and that allows the pharma company to sell that drug without any competition. So no one else can make the same drug and sell it. But once that patent expires, then you get the so-called generic manufacturers entering the market. And this essentially brings down the sales oftentimes by 80 or 90%. So a molecule that's selling $10 billion a year for a disease, once its patent life expires, the next year it'll only sell $1 to $2 billion. And then the year after that, it'll be even less. And so you get the so-called patent cliff, which is the revenue of a pharma company can significantly drop in 1 year. And therefore, they need to make sure they're constantly refilling their pipeline to get new products out into the market that are going to recover for the lost revenue from the patent expirations. So that's why they do so much buying, because it's so hard to find a drug that even though these pharma companies have such big research teams, they're not able to come up with all of the drugs required to refill the company's pipeline.
Got it.
So that's why they buy biotech assets.
Got it. Yeah. So these phase 2, phase 3 are obviously the leading indicators for what could be their next blockbuster. Yes. How much are these blockbuster drugs worth?
Well, if a drug makes $1 billion a year and you can sell it for 10 years, then, or even 15 years, then the net present value of that drug is, roughly speaking, let's say $5 to $10 billion.
Got it. And so that brings us into AI and specifically like what you're working on in Charm. So why is AI useful in this process?
Yeah, so AI is useful. Well, I guess AI can be applied to many areas in drug discovery, and theoretically and technically, AI should be in the future applied to each and everything that the human society does. But let's maybe focus on today. So today, where I see AI having the largest impact is in the preclinical side of the drug discovery. So this is before the drug enters clinical trials, where you need to actually find the drug that binds to the protein, stays long enough in the human body, and is safe. And by being able to model some of those properties on a computer with AI, I think that's where, now and in the next 5 years, AI is going to have a really big impact in drug discovery. So that means that you don't need to do all of this, very expensive lab testing. You can just test it on a computer instead. Yeah.
What does that lab testing look like? If we weren't able to simulate it in something like DragonFold, what does that look like?
So the lab testing just involves you, actually physically making the drug, physically synthesizing it using chemistry, and then physically testing it against the protein to see whether it binds, for example. And yeah, that's a biophysical assay, for example. So yeah, it's just a standard lab assay, but it takes time and takes money.
So in reality, if we were to do this in a lab together without any AI, you mentioned before when we spoke, then you might be testing 5,000 different variations of a compound. And this is outside of the human system, simply between these two different kind of compounds that we're combining to see how they react.
Well, one is a protein and the other is a compound.
Got it. And so with these, when we're doing this, let's say in the lab, what does that cost? What does that cost in terms of time?
If you were to do a standard drug discovery project, it can cost anywhere from, let's say, $20 to $50 million. And most of this cost is because you need to experimentally make or synthesize thousands of molecules, let's say 2,500, and you then need to test all of these molecules against the protein. And then the best versions of those molecules you need to test in vivo studies, right? So you need to test it in different animals. And that is a very expensive process. And yeah, that costs about, let's say, as I mentioned, $25 to $50 million. And it takes a long time, let's say 3 to 7 years.
And I guess specifically with DragonFold, which is the product that you've been working on in Charm, what does my workflow look like in this platform?
Yeah, so with DragonFold, what you're really doing is you're doing a lot of that testing on a computer. So you're, for example, instead of actually synthesizing a molecule, you're just drawing it on a computer screen, and then you're using DragonFold to predict how it interacts in the protein. And then based on whether the DragonFold prediction is telling you that it's going to interact well or not, you can then decide whether you actually want to make that molecule in real life and test it against the protein. So from our experience, we found that this can reduce the number of molecules you need to make by a significant amount.
How much when you say significant amount?
Yeah, so for example, I guess on our, on one of our drug programs, which is, which is showing really good results, and we'll probably start testing that in humans in early 2026. That we've ended up making about, probably 500 molecules. So when you compare that to the 2,500 to 5,000, that's a 80 to 90% reduction in the number of molecules being made. Yeah.
And so we've got Charm, we've got, you mentioned earlier, Isomorphic Labs and DeepMind. There's also Exscientia, which is soon merged with Recursion. Like, how are you in Charm thinking about which part of the, what value you can add that's differentiated versus these other players?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, ultimately, if you think about the various problems in drug discovery, probably the toughest problem is actually, finding a molecule that binds to a protein, finding a drug that binds to a protein. And so that's really the area we focus on. The other thing that we are doing to try and help the AI with that problem is to actually generate data, right? So there is obviously a lot of publicly available data that we use and other people use. But actually, if you actually generate some in-house data, some proprietary data on the protein or on the disease-causing protein that you're working on, that can really, in our experience, help the AI to make even better predictions and get even more accurate. And you can obviously see this is a sliding scale, right? We're still synthesizing molecules, right? As I mentioned, about 500. So we're not at zero yet. So there's still a while for the AI to go, to go from 500 to zero. It needs to improve significantly in accuracy. So there's still a lot of work to do. Yeah.
So you raised, I think 2022, you raised 50 million, which was a year after you founded the company. One of the people I spoke with, Tess at Lux Capital, one of the questions she had was, how was that experience going from research scientist in a company just a couple of years before, starting a company and within a year raising 50 million?
Yeah, I mean, it was clearly a wild experience, right? And I'm very grateful that we were able to, paint a very compelling vision to be able to raise that much money. And would definitely do it again if I could. But really now what we're focused on is making sure that we use that capital to deliver, essentially our first drugs that are ready for human testing, which I think we're basically there. So that's good.
Who do you think is leading the way in AI-powered drug discovery?
Other than Charm, of course. I do think, there are lots of companies doing really good research. Relay Therapeutics is doing some really good. They've shown some really good use cases in how you use computation to actually make a drug. Genesis Therapeutics has reproduced AlphaFold3, which has been very helpful. Not only them, they did it in collaboration with MIT. So I respect that piece of work. Let's see, in the biologics space, Zara is a company that recently launched. They raised $1 billion. David's a co-founder over there as well. So I'm sure exciting work will come out from them as well. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting players in the ecosystem. And I think it's the field has a very bright future. Like all fields, they sometimes take a while to fully mature, but I think it will mature at some point. And when it does mature, this will be the new way to do drug discovery. And no one will do it in the previous way. Yeah.
Based on what you know about building Charm so far, I guess, what's the hardest part about building the company? Is it the therapeutic areas you target? Is it the quality of the simulations you're building?
So I would say the hardest part is coping with things that are out of your control. So drug discovery is, a bit of it's in many ways, there's a lot of luck involved. And sometimes you'll try everything and you'll do your best, but you will still fail. In fact, that's most of the times. And so in many ways, it's quite a humbling industry where you mostly fail. And, I guess it's just developing the coping mechanisms to, understand that is a fact and understand that, all you can do is do what's in your control to try and get the drug as far as it can go, and then let the rest come down to luck.
You're in a business where you're balancing like net new creations, things that are being made for the first time, namely these drugs that you're working on, with actually building a business, a machine around creating that value. How do you juggle the two?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately it comes down to hiring really good people. If you hire really good people, then I think that's already half the battle done. And making sure that they have clear goals and they're executing well on those goals. Because ultimately, and especially in drug discovery, it's such a complex industry, and there are so many skill sets required to do it well that you yourself can't know it all, and so therefore you need to hire really good people. Yeah.
In our call when we spoke before, you mentioned that creating software usually doesn't require so much experience, but when you're applying it to biotech, the reason that you haven't seen so many people, let's say under the age of 30, that have come up with a new blockbuster drug is because it takes a huge amount of domain-specific knowledge, in the space, and not every door is a two-way door. Could you unpack that?
Yeah, that's right. And also, exactly, there's so many different things that you need to do, and each of those things requires a different set of expertise, such that you need to hire each of the experts in all of those different areas, and then you need to coordinate that operation. So it just turns out that's just very difficult to do. Yeah.
But tell us in a bit more detail about these feedback loops, right? Because when we're writing code, if it doesn't work, you can kind of rerun it, you can test for bugs, and then you can just run it again. So how does that look in reality in Charm?
The ultimate feedback loop is whether the drug works in humans or not. And that's like a sort of 5-year or more feedback loop. That's obviously very long. But then even on a more granular level, when you're just testing, for example, whether the drug is able to bind to the protein, that's already, a 4-week feedback loop, because you need to make the molecule and then test it against the protein, which can take a while. So actually, it's a very long feedback loop, and that's one of the challenges with innovating and creating technologies in this area.
You mentioned that hiring the best people was, over half the challenge solved. You're working with machine learning researchers, you're working with biomedical scientists, you're working with data engineers. These are not people that usually come from, all of the same background. How do you approach finding the best people?
Yeah, I think it's a few things, right? I think the first thing, and this might sound so cliche, but the first thing is passion. So first of all, liking what they do and demonstrating that they like what they do and demonstrating a lot of passion. I think that is, by and large, at least for me, the number one element. Then there's intelligence. Of course, if they are intelligent, then they're gonna do well, and I guess that's to some extent correlated with passion. And then there's do they work well in a team, right? Because drug discovery and AI drug discovery is a team sport, and so sometimes you can have the first two, passion and intelligence, but you won't have the next one, which is working in a team. So I think it's it's really those three things, and trying to assess candidates for those three things. Yeah.
Okay, so based on that, we've talked about how the long cycle times to get this feedback really are really what stands out about building in the biotech space. I guess what advice would you have for technical co-founders that might be from a similar background? Expectation versus reality.
Yeah, so I guess if you're a technical co-founder, you need to decide what you're going to do. Are you going to make technologies and sell that to drug companies? Or are you going to make technologies and use those technologies yourself to create drugs? Depending on which path you choose has a very different outcome for how the company is going to go. If you choose the latter, which is make technologies to develop drugs, then you're going to need to hire a lot of experienced people, because the technology can only do so much, and you still need all of the other drug discovery expertise. And you're going to also have to, make sure that you deliver drugs, because if you don't deliver drugs, then you will ultimately be valued on the drugs you deliver. So that's that path. On the other part, and I know less about the other path, but over there, as long as you can create something useful for drug companies that they can use, and that creates revenue, then you're probably good. Yeah.
Who outside of Charm right now is doing the most interesting work? Who are you looking at and going, wow, that's pretty inspiring?
I think the AI companies, Anthropic and OpenAI, and others are doing great work. I'm really excited about what they're doing. You know, for anyone that knows me, they'll know that I'm pretty much addicted to ChatGPT. You know, I think now people are starting to, you know, move these large language models to being able to do things like control your computer screen. And I think that's really interesting as well. So I'm a really big fan of all of that field.
Yeah, I'm curious. How is AI? You mentioned you're a big ChatGPT fan. How is it showing up in your life outside of Charm?
Well, I mean, you know, I try and use it for anything and everything, right? So anytime I want to analyze anything or do anything or just summarize something or just try and understand anything, I turn to AI as a first pass. And you know, sometimes that involves, for example, feeding the AI with useful information. So, you know, feeding it with relevant papers that might result in understanding this particular problem. Because sometimes it doesn't quite remember those papers on its own, so you need to actually feed it in. Yeah.
I think maybe you might take for granted just how much, because you're from an engineering background, let's say, or from a chemistry background, and you have experience coding, just how you can use these kind of AI systems.
Yeah.
For non-technical people or non-technical co-founders, what other than just asking ChatGPT questions do you think are the quick wins that they can take into, you know, their life?
Well, I think right now it's probably not more than asking ChatGPT questions. And the reason why is because that's all you've got. You've got an interface that's like a Google search bar. So that's really all you can do. But soon, as time progresses, OpenAI and Anthropic will integrate these models more closely with your computer. So you'll be able to move from asking questions to actually instructing the AI what to do in a higher level way, right? So you might say, coordinate this meeting, you know, with this person next week, for example. Or you might say, you know, I need to send off 5 emails, and I need to send off this email. When I get a reply, do it for me, right? And it'll automatically do it for you. So I think, yeah, a lot of the administrative work has the potential to actually be automated. Yeah.
That would be these kind of agents.
Yeah, the agents. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Outside of Charm, what drives you, Laksh? Like, help us understand inside the world of your brain.
Yeah. Well, you know, my ultimate vision is that ultimately, you know, AI, and I don't know if you've read this recent blog post by Dario Amodei. He's the CEO of Anthropic. But you know, ultimately, AI is essentially going to make humans, let's say, 10 to 100 times more productive, right? So the question then is, first of all, how do you get there? Second of all, what does that look like? What does it look like in a world where AI is 10 to 100 times, making humans 10 to 100 times more productive? And third of all, how do we finally leverage that technology to ultimately make the world a better place? I feel like I want to spend my life doing that, right? Like contributing to the transition from today to, you know, a fully AI-enabled world where, you know, we're able to, let's say, cure cancer completely with AI. Yeah.
One of the things you talked about before is that in order to kind of bite off this massive challenge, you have to be an infinite learner. What does it mean for you, and what are the areas where you were like early on in perhaps Charm's existence where you thought, I really feel out of my depth here and just how much I need to understand? How did you approach those times?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's two things, right? So you will feel out of your depth a lot. So the first is just keep learning, never stop learning. But the second is recognize that even if you keep learning and never stop learning at a very fast rate, you will still be rate limited, and you know, you still won't be able to learn everything. And that's where actually you then need to hire really good people who, you know, will have a lot more experience doing that and will be able to solve the problem. Yeah.
And I guess reflecting on your journey, what would you tell Laksh perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, before Charm and all of this started? What would you tell him now, knowing what you know?
Probably I would tell, you know, Laksh from 4 years ago or 5 years ago that the most important thing is clinical data, and make sure that you think really hard about how you're going to get to that clinical data.
Yeah. What was the gap?
Well, I guess the gap was maybe, and it was a different time back then as well, that maybe, if you create loads of drugs that are, looking good in the preclinical phase, that will be sufficient. But actually, nowadays, you really need at least one drug that is on the path to showing really strong clinical data.
I always love to ask folks like you that have, started building businesses, who are the people that have inspired you along the journey?
I mean, coming back to OpenAI, Anthropic, I am very much inspired by, the leaders at those organizations, Sam Altman, Dario Amodei. I am inspired by people who've made big contributions to the field, both in drug discovery and AI, but also in both, right? So for example, David Baker, he's an inspiration. The people who developed AlphaFold, they're an inspiration as well. And I'm really glad to actually be friends with some of them as well. Yeah.
And I guess final question from me, Laksh. How old are you now?
I just turned 27.
You just turned 27. Okay, wow. So let's fast forward 50 years in the future, and you and I are sat next to each other on the proverbial rocking chair, and I turn to you under the stars. Imagine there are stars. Yeah. I turn to you under the stars and I just say, Laksh, what was it all for?
I think it was all for, at the end of the day, making humans live a better life and improving their life, improving society, and increasing happiness overall. I think that's what it's all for.
This has been so much fun. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Joe. I really appreciate it.